Good morning, listeners. My name is Christian Jones.
And my name is Micah, and welcome to the Morning Ponderings podcast.
In this podcast, we aim to explore the possibilities allotted to us by our limited understanding and knowledge.
And the goal of that is that empathy for other viewpoints can flourish.
Yeah.
All right.
So good morning, Micah.
Good morning. How is your morning going? How's the last 3 days been? Because we only recorded like 3 days ago.
Yeah, it's true. Oh my goodness. And it's been pretty good. I haven't, nothing super crazy has happened. My wife and son, I've kind of been pretty much recovered from COVID at this point. They're still overcoming the extreme fatigue that we were all hit by afterwards. So
Fine.
that's kind of wrapping up nicely. But I've been pretty good. But you were talking a little bit a second ago before the intro about a long shift that you had yesterday.
I did. Well, I guess you'd say it was a normal length shift for most people, but the whole weekend has just been crazy. It's tax-free weekend in Missouri, and I work at Costco, and that means that you can buy, lots of electronics, laptops, computers, and not have tax. So that's like possibly $100 off. So I work in the electronics department in major sales. And so I just had like a wild weekend. And yesterday I had like a full 8 hours and it was just crazy the whole time.
Yeah. When you work in retail and anytime you're working more than part-time hours, it's like you're working two shifts because it can get nuts, man.
Yeah. And especially because Kansas City instituted a mask mandate in like all citywide. And so Costco, obviously in Kansas City, is enforcing that. And some people don't like that. And they are very rude about it.
Oh my goodness. I could not imagine the kind of absolute,
bad.
Hell
it's
that
bad.
A retail worker has to go through.
Yeah, it's bad.
Especially nowadays. Ugh.
I am glad I'm not a manager right now because they got to deal with all those crazy people.
Oh my gosh. Well, my heart goes out to all of the retail workers out there who are just dealing with the worst of the worst.
Yeah. Yeah, it's great. It's great.
Your image just popped up on my screen for a moment there and you were just staring off into the distance, 1,000-yard stare like.
Yeah.
I can tell you've been moved. You've been shaken.
It's all right. I'll be okay.
You will recover.
Yes, indeed.
All right. So because there has not been a ton of time to elapse between the previous time we've recorded and now, there's not a ton to talk about in terms of small talk. So we could just kind of jump straight into the topic at hand.
We sure can. Yeah. And maybe we should, I feel like I want to say something about our last episode just because, one, it was so recent. And also I feel like it was a really good conversation. And honestly, it was a lot heavier than I thought it was going to be. It definitely hit me afterwards. Like, man, like I just felt like that was a weighty topic. And you can even just hear in the recording and as I was editing it, how many times we kind of just pause and sigh because it's just so disappointing how many people are just affected by such a toxic belief in eternal punishment and hell and how that has affected our lives and just how we see it continue to affect other people's lives. It's really sad. And I think it was good we talked about it the way that we did.
In a way, it was kind of like talking about a murder weapon, a weapon that has, like we've heard, has been used to hurt and drive away and even push people to a critical point all around the world.
Yeah.
And has even been levied against us and our families to bring up fear and demand compliance within Christianity. And it just, when you're looking at what was at one point just an everyday item that was hell, which is weird to think of it in that kind of terms, but there comes a point when it was normalized. But then to look at it and recognize it for what it is and the amount of harm that is caused, that is the weight that comes with that is well warranted.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. So I think it's good we have a slightly lighter topic this time, talking about heaven.
Oh boy, I don't know about that.
Maybe it's not. It's not as heavy. At least we're not having to bring our minds to eternal suffering and such.
Yeah.
But yeah, even heaven has been used in a way that, in many toxic ways as well, which we are gonna get into. It seems like in every belief or religion, you have this polarity where you've got this negative thing that is driving and motivating you, and you also have this positive thing / reward that is being dangled in front of you that is also motivating you. So last week, obviously, we talked about the negative thing that is driving you out of fear, and now we are talking about the positive thing that is like the other side of that coin that you're working for.
And I want to briefly mention, we might dive into this more later, but there is a confusing especially within Christianity and our background, the concept of heaven is quite confusing because it's oftentimes thought of and spoken of as a reward. But when you speak at length or in detail about it, that is language that is commonly tried to be avoided, because the whole idea of heaven is it's not something you deserve. It's something that's given to you. But you have to do things to deserve it. Well, for it to be given to you, namely, like it's being offered. I guess one way that I thought about it when I was steeped in Christianity was it's like you're really hungry and somebody's offering you a loaf of bread, and that loaf of bread is completely free of charge, no strings attached. All you have to do is reach your hand out, grab it, and eat it. And so that's one way that I used to think about heaven in terms of just the reward nature of it. But it's way more complicated than that nowadays. I recognize, especially when placed alongside of hell, in that there's this whole complex manner of like, well, you can't have both. You have to relinquish those things which are of hell in order to accept that which is the bread. So you like have your arms full of all these things that are sins, and you have to drop that before you can have space in your hands to carry this massive loaf of bread.
Yeah, it is complicated. You'd think it'd be nice if there was just no strings attached, and that's how it was. But nope, there's lots of strings they like to attach.
And I mean, it's no wonder why we would want to attach a bunch of strings to this, because you don't just want a mass murderer who totally feels justified in their mass murder to be strolling through heaven eyeing new victims, because that's would completely undermine the purpose of heaven, which is, hey, Micah, what is the purpose of heaven?
Yeah, well, there's obviously many views, but heaven is supposed to be the ultimate paradise. It's supposed to be the place of no suffering, the place where you are just filled with joy and peace and love and acceptance and all of the good things of this life are supposed to be there. At least that is, I mean, that's one view. Though some versions of heaven or the afterlife could be even just being absorbed into the eternal consciousness, where you aren't suffering, you're not in pain, but also you kind of are just dropped back into the pool of the ocean, I guess. Like I don't know how else to describe it. Like you're a drop and then you return to the ocean, and now you are all in the ocean. And
I think there's a video that is done by I forget the name of the YouTube channel. I think it's like a German name. You might know it, but the title of the video is called The Egg. And it explores this concept of humanity being a singular consciousness. And that consciousness is divvied up into many small portions and placed into many different bodies. And these bodies are like cups that can only hold so much consciousness in them at a time. So the amount of knowledge and experience is oftentimes that fills that cup is usually just unique to that one person. And eventually, every cup, which is every possible human experience on the planet, will be filled with this consciousness. And then eventually all of those cups will be emptied again into this basin that is you. And so technically, so in a way, you are everybody and everybody is you. And those collective experiences are maturing you to the point where at some point when it's all collected together, you will begin to remember all of your lives and all of your decisions. And that will birth you into this being, this celestial being that will exist among other celestial beings. And so there's a video called The Egg, and that is kind of its concept, what it explores as a facet of the afterlife, in that in a way this is pre-life. And then life actually waits for us after. And it's an interesting concept that, I mean, there's no basis for that like really roots it in reality. But I mean, there's no basis that really roots any of this in reality anyway. It's one of those possibilities that we're here to explore. And it's one of those things where it's like, I could see why that could be something I'd hope for. Because that would be pretty cool in that there's a great lack of empathy across our planet, and that's a major problem. And it would be nice it's nice to think that that's an issue that's going to sort itself out. But yeah,
definitely. That is an interesting that's an interesting view. You
were talking about how when we die we fade into this consciousness, like this singular consciousness, and it made me think of that.
That definitely has some similar vibes, I guess. But there's just as many views as there are of hell. There are quite a few about what the afterlife paradise could be, and where the good karma sends you, or where your correct belief sends you, is interesting. Like a lot of, talking about Christianity will say, well, there's going to be streets of gold and I'm going to have a mansion because of that one verse taken out of context that Jesus says, and all of these different things. So
what was the take of paradise that you were most, I mean, for me, there was several different takes on paradise that I had throughout my life. And there's one that I ended up kind of hoping for the most. Did you ever come to like that understanding of paradise that you were like, okay, this is going to be, I think there's this general understanding among Christians that like we can't really wrap our minds around it. So anything is going to just be an attempt, and it's likely to be different than what we expect, which I think is a very interesting possible truth that you can put across all of Christianity, including the nature of God. But did you ever settle upon an understanding of heaven or paradise that was your favorite, for lack of a better term? What was that like?
Yeah, I did. Growing up, I was kind of under the impression that it was some castle in the clouds, and we would all be flying around and we'd get wings and kind of things like that, which strangely are even somewhat perpetuated by adults, where streets of gold and I get a giant mansion, many rooms, all this stuff. But as I grew older, I started to see, I don't know if that would really be very heavenly. That kind of sounds like a strange gated community type thing, which just doesn't sound like heaven to me. And so, and as I learned more about the Bible, I also realized that was not very accurate of what they would even describe. But I feel like I came to an idea of basically having perfect community, and that we would all just be up with, everybody who's there, and we would have perfect community with each other and community with God. And we would still like work, but we wouldn't be working for money because that wouldn't be a thing. We would just have everything taken care of. We would only work for the thing to do the things that we enjoy.
Yeah.
Like, who knows, maybe I'd be making music. And for a time I thought it's just going to be worship nonstop. But then as I thought more about that, I was like, maybe that's not actually a very fun existence.
I mean, there are times in church that there's these, there's a term, it's 7 words, 11 verses for some worship music, where you just sing the same 7 words over and over and over and over and over again. And sometimes it feels like that can go on for an eternity.
Sometimes, yeah.
And especially if like the spirit is really moving, or rather, as some people have pointed out, the manipulation tactics are really working good, then you could go on and on for quite a while. It's amazing the kind of endurance that one experiences when you're on that spiritual high.
Yeah.
And so this is a bit of a trigger warning for people who are like Micah. So sorry, I just kind of sprung it upon you, because I know that that's something that weighs heavily upon your heart, having come from that kind of a background. But I'm actually really curious with the whole concept of heaven being this eternal worship music, this eternal worship service. With your wrestlings and your understanding of that side of Christianity, what are your thoughts and feelings towards that? And is that something you're willing to explore?
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a good question. I know that idea comes from this kind of misreading of, well, I don't know, I would say it's a misreading of a passage in Revelation where the angels are flying around God and they're singing constantly, just, holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, which is really interesting if you actually learn some of the historical context around that, because that was something that was saying to Caesar. And then John kind of takes that and flips it and is like, well, now it's going to be about God. So there are some like interesting things there, but people then take that to say, well, I guess that's what we'll be doing in heaven. And some people like that because they really love worship music. But like you said, I have done a lot of reflection on that and looked, into worship music a bit more to see how you could write pretty much any words you want. And if you play the right chords, you have the right sounds, you have the right kind of pads going in the background, you can make anybody feel like they're feeling the Spirit, what they would call the Spirit. And the song could be absolute heresy or just absolutely toxic, which is sadly, there's
very common.
And even if it's not, there's I guarantee at least 1 or 2 lines in there that has some toxic belief in it, which is what I started to find over time. Is there were less and less songs on my song bank, like as I was kind of exiting out of the church, but was still a worship leader, that I was willing to play because I was like, that line has a really toxic belief in it. So I guess I won't play that. But then I started to realize, well, almost all of these songs do. So with that, I really doubt if that's what we're doing in heaven, that we'll be singing any songs that have been written here, because I think there's a lot of misunderstandings and things that are wrong, like just, I guess, theologically within worship music. Then also on the other side of that, I just think we'd get bored. Like, is that our whole purpose? Like if all we did on earth was just sing constantly, like you'd get bored. Like I promise you would get bored. And if you're going to get bored here, I really think you'd get bored there. Like, is that all we were made for? Like that, I thought that was what heaven was supposed to be, is like, we finally become what we were made to be, like what we were always made to be. Is that all we are? Like, is that, well, that kind of gets into like, what does that say about human nature and like what you believe about human nature? Because if that's the extent of what human nature is, if we were just created to worship and like bow to this creature, for one, that really sounds kind of primitive, because that's what very ancient things did, is that all they thought is like, well, I just need to appease the God and just bow constantly and sacrifice constantly. Have we not grown out of that? Like, have we not seen that maybe if God does exist, he's a little better than that? Maybe that's not his number one desire. And is that all we were made for? Yeah.
So before we go too far from the topic of worship, so I also want to dive into that. One of the questions that has really I've had to mull over a lot, and it's this idea of like, okay, what characteristics distinguish praise and worship that is authentic from praise and worship which is manufactured and manipulative? And this is something that's important to my wife and I too, because she's the worship leader at our church, and she's constantly seeking to make decisions on what songs to lead and all that. And it's been a point of stress, and I won't speak for her too much on it, but it can be a task to figure that out. And from my own reflections, I find it actually really similar to the concept of music and songs in like a movie, in cinema, or in musicals, in that if you just throw in generic pop songs throughout a musical, it gets really cheesy and really campy. And it becomes meaningless, just this hollow sound that people are just bobbing their heads to. It's this manufactured soundtrack. But when you throw in original music and sounds, or in music and lyrics that express the soul of the person who is going through whatever experience, that is when the music becomes meaningful. That's when it becomes authentic, because there's a direct expression of what you're experiencing, what your wants, your desires, and your fears are. And so I imagine if there's praise and worship in heaven, it is going to be of that authentic variety. And it might just be that every song sung is an original expression of the soul, and that we learn as people how to sing and develop music in the same way we develop sentences and words. And that way it can be that authentic expression kind of on the spot.
Yes.
Maybe.
Yeah. So I think to kind of speak into that is for one, it's going to be tough, because that's an incredibly complex answer that I could give, because I think it's an incredibly complex subject. Like, it's not a black and white, simple, here is how you don't emotionally manipulate people and have an authentic worship place. Because I think I do still believe that you can have an authentic communal worship experience that is not toxically manipulative. I do believe that. So, but I think it's really complex. So here are some of the, I guess, layers that you need to kind of sift through when thinking about that. So for one, you have to recognize that all music to some extent is manipulative. And I stand by that. That's what music is for. Music is written, whether it's Christian, whether it's not, like, it's written to express emotion and to elicit some kind of emotion, right? Like you listen to music because you feel things. It makes you feel good, or it helps you whenever you're feeling sad, or express anger, like whatever it is. It's made for that. It's something that I think is really beautiful. But you have to recognize you're wielding a power there. So how you wield that is going to be really important. What most of people who at least that I know, who are in like the deconstruction community, who talk about how worship has been used very toxically, it's not necessarily always the songs themselves, but it's what comes right after the songs. It's what is said during the sermon, that you've now had this, like you've had some of your walls broken down. You've kind of been brought to this vulnerable place. And then the sermon is, you are evil, you are bad, you should feel ashamed of yourself, God is angry with you, like things like that. And so it's paired with these really, really toxic beliefs that are extremely damaging to who we are as people. But because of that worship music, that you felt something, now you're going to believe that, and you're going to take that, and you're going to live your life holding that shame. And so it's not even like, I definitely don't think it's the entire burden of your wife as a worship leader. Like, she can't control what's said on stage. And, you know, I don't know like some of the beliefs of your church, but I at least know at some of the churches I've been to that that's been the case, where like maybe the worship set didn't really have any super toxic beliefs in it, but man, the sermon did. And so like you are kind of working together in that. So I think that's something that should hopefully alleviate some pressure, because like it's not all the worship leaders' fault. But also, if we're going to talk about worship being an honest expression, I find it interesting that so many churches, like a majority of churches, are singing like the same songs that are from the same style. And is that an honest expression if they're all kind of the same style? Like, why? Like, I know we have like bluegrass worship, it's just very rare. And we have like, you know, some churches will do some rap, they might throw some rap in there, or even some jazz. But for me, what I see is that worship music is kind of made to use very simple, repetitive things that are almost like similar things that you would see in, I'm trying to think of like something else that's trying to curate some kind of emotion, but also like just the very repetitive nature of things sometimes is.
Would you maybe equate it artistically to like the what are they called? They're like those little chubby angel kids with no variety really in their facial expressions. They're just made to look cute, and they like do those little prayer positions, and they're just these cheaply made little figurines that are made to elicit emotions of feel good in people.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, like I think people writing worship music could get a little more creative, because I don't want to use the term brainwashing, but it's somewhere in that arena of like when you repeat something over and over again and you have the right sounds that like are convincing you that thing is true. So like I said, you could say almost anything, and if you have that worship thing and you've got the person with the rapport up there, you're gonna buy it, right? And so I think you got to steward it well. And I also want to say there's nothing wrong with having an emotional response during music or during worship, because that's what music is made for. And I'm not saying that isn't God necessarily. I just think most of the time it probably isn't.
Yeah, and you should probably take some time to reflect upon the way you're feeling and the reasons you're feeling it, because if you don't take that time, then you open up the door for somebody else to tell you why and how.
Yeah, and at the same time, you shouldn't take things wholesale. Like just because a song really speaks to you doesn't mean that everything that song said is 100% true. Because like certain songs will talk about like, you know, have even just different theologies of what the crucifixion means. Like some of them will have like the satisfaction theory in there, which like now we're getting into like deeper theology, but maybe you aren't trained to like notice those things, but some will have like penal substitutionary atonement or Christus Victor. And those are all different views of what it means that Jesus died on the cross. And you might not even notice, but those are part of the theology of that song. So like, don't just take things wholesale. I had one other thing to say that I think was important. Oh, another thing to add in some more complexity is something was going around TikTok of people kind of calling out, I think it was Hillsong, or maybe it was Bethel. I think it was probably Bethel, who had this song called Healer. Just look up Healer by Bethel or possibly Hillsong. But it was written by a guy who claimed like he had cancer and he'd been healed from cancer. Years later, we found out that was a lie. He never had cancer. He completely lied about his story. And then he used that song that so many people then were like, it gave them so much hope that they could be healed of whatever terminal illness, whatever they had. And they parade around with this belief that like, if you're not healed, you don't have enough faith. If you're not healed, then you have secret sin in your life. And so then that adds some complexities. Like, where did this song come from? Like, if I was a worship leader and I learned that, I would never sing that song again. And that's a song that people still sing on like a regular basis.
Yeah.
He's still making money off that. Like, he made bank off of a lie. And that is tragic. And that is another facet to this, is like some of these artists are writing from a dishonest place, and you would never know because their music sounds good, but they're making money off of dishonesty. And how
many people will that manipulate into ruining their lives, driving their lives into the ground because they think they're unworthy and they need to be humbled if God is going to heal them. Yeah. And it's tragic, the stories you hear of that sort of thing happening. And
there's too many of them.
I'm glad you spoke to those issues, because anybody listening who might be victim or have fallen victim to that, awareness is power, especially in this case. And we hope that either if you've been through that you've recovered well, or that this can help you in whatever situation you're in right now. But yeah, that's good information to have. And it does. Yeah.
It sucks that, and I think it hurts for me because like I used to love Bethel music, and recently like it's been somewhat painful to just look back at my experience in the church and see how I've been a part of a system that has harmed people, and how I, have wielded that power. Granted, I have to give myself some grace for just not knowing, like, I didn't know that before this, like a couple of weeks ago. And so I can't blame myself too much, but also, did I ever look into it? And is there any accountability for that? There's no accountability. And so that just sucks.
It's crazy how these systems are in place to manipulate congregations of people who are really well-meaning and really want the best for the people around them and for society. But they're manipulated into thinking that the way to go about that is to wield these powerful tools in toxic ways.
Yeah.
And in a way, those people who wield those things are victims themselves, who oftentimes have other, like, it's this weird, almost like a disease that spreads of victimization. And it's really unfortunate. It's hard not to demonize somebody who's been manipulated into that position where it's damaging.
Yeah.
And I think anybody who's grown up in Christianity and been in that for a while, or had any kind of influence, has been a perpetrator of that. And I mean, even I probably have to an extent. I taught Sunday school for a little while, and I can't recall exactly what all the lessons I was teaching were, but I do remember growing more and more dissonant from the stuff I was supposed to be teaching.
Yep, same.
And slowly I would say, well, a lot of people think this, a lot of other people think this.
Yep.
I personally am not super certain about either. But if you're looking for the Wesleyan belief, which is the denomination I found myself teaching in, this is the way it is. But we could be wrong.
Yeah. And I think that's a perfectly healthy way to teach something.
Yeah. I mean,
That's how,
I didn't, I
yeah.
don't think I always taught it that way, but I eventually moved into teaching it that way.
Yeah.
I'm not really teaching anymore because I've really fallen into that like place of, I really embraced my level of uncertainty.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how much parents would appreciate me expressing that to their kids when they're trusting me to teach them Wesleyan ideology.
Mm-hmm.
And it's weird because, like, on one hand, I want to do damage control and I want to help the youth understand that there's more nuance and wonder in the world than they've been led to believe.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, I don't want to do that and betray trust and hurt relationships and build potential walls that would keep me from being able to have any kind of influence. So it's this
Yeah.
weird position I find myself in.
That is the position I was in when I was at my church. That's why I had to leave, because at some point I was like, I refuse to teach the theology they believe because I think it's toxic. And but I got to stay true to myself, like, and I can't just like betray their trust either. And so it became like I shouldn't be here. So
Yeah,
I left, which I would go. Were you going to say something?
oh yeah. It's interesting because COVID was kind of the reason why I stopped teaching as much as I had before, and actually want to meet with the youth pastor sometime in the future and talk to him about where I am, the sort of beliefs I hold, and if I were to re-enter that position of teaching because he's expressed an interest in me entering into that again, what that would mean for me and whether or not that's something he thinks is valuable and important and needed within teaching our kids. And I mean, the approach I intend to take is acknowledging the reality that we can't just expect the youth to not have questions and to not be faced with questions and to be certain of everything. We don't want them to feel like they are lesser than or invalid because they aren't at a certain level of certainty.
Yeah.
And I can help with that, I believe. I can help normalize uncertainty and fostering growth from that.
Yeah.
And so I still feel like that's something valuable I could bring to the youth program at our church and something that I think would be very healthy. But I don't know, that kind of strays pretty far from what I have understood the Wesleyan denomination's beliefs and dogma to be. So while I might see it as valuable, I don't know if that's something that they would want because it's so far apart from what is usual. But I mean, I haven't talked with the youth pastor about it yet and haven't had that conversation to know. So
yeah,
my wife has been encouraging me not to just assume because that's the easy routes and that's what I would normally want to do.
Yeah, but, same. Yeah, no, I feel that. I feel like I would be a case study of that in my youth group because I was like that, where I had a lot of things where it's like, I don't necessarily even care who's right. Like I know a lot of people have this view. A lot of people have this view. I don't care. Let me talk about how this actually affects our lives and how we should live regardless of whether or not like creation happened in 7 days or a million years. You know, like what is that story about and what does that tell us about ourselves and how we can live now? Like who cares? Who cares? Why do we have to argue about anyway?
Why do we have to be so fixated on being right and being correct? And basically just ignoring the fact that we are humans made with limited capacity and flaws.
Yeah. And so anyway, so I kind of taught with that style of like not giving these black and white answers like almost ever. Like I just never did. And what I found is that the youth loved it. Like they came alive whenever I stopped kind of giving dogmas, I guess, which I mean, usually we use that in a negative connotation, but dogma is just like a strongly held belief, basically. So like a black and white, like, hey, this is what it is. This is what we believe. Once I stopped doing that and we started exploring our questions, once we started to make it more of a discussion rather than like me just like teaching you, man, they came alive and they loved it and they were engaged and they were like excited to talk about things. Like that's whenever things started to like really grow is whenever I allowed them to ask questions. I allowed them to not just like absorb and suck in like black and white answers, but
Mm.
to question and to explore like the color and the gray and like all of the things in between. That's whenever I saw growth. But sadly,
Yeah, I mean, sorry, go on.
I like a lot of the black and white had just been so deeply ingrained that some things we were never able to get past because they could not let go of what had been just drilled into them, especially things about hell. And so some things we couldn't even explore some color because things were that deeply ingrained, even after 2 years of being with them.
Yeah. And I saw the exact same thing sort of happen with my kids in that, especially in one situation, when I had first started teaching, there was one youth who had felt so alienated because his questions weren't allowed. He was not allowed to express them. And he was in this place of practically atheism, and or at least from what I could tell. But he just was kind of the outcast of the group because he was struggling with his beliefs as much as he was. And when I started teaching and I started exploring more of the nuance and talking about how it doesn't make you a terrible Christian or a terrible human being to have uncertainty and to express that uncertainty and explore it. And I started diving into the questions and the hard truths and the things that we don't really know as Christians and what is possible in terms of creationism versus evolution and all of those nuances. And eventually, he went from being sitting on the outskirts reading a book every Sunday school to actually joining us at the table and engaging in conversation.
Yeah.
And so it's incredible how much I feel people, especially youth, are craving like actual intellectual honesty when it comes to expressing what we do and what we do not know and what is speculative. So I really saw life come from that.
Yeah, what I have learned, because I've like been to a couple youth conferences, because I guess the listeners maybe don't know, I was a youth and worship minister at a church. I really only left like about a month ago. But I was there for 2 years. And prior to that, I had been a worship leader for since senior year in high school, all through college. And then this was the church that I was at for a couple of years after college. And so at these youth conferences, what I learned about the Gen Zers is that they crave authenticity and they sniff out fakeness so fast and they don't want to be a part of it. Like if they know that you're being fake, even giving a fake sense of certainty in ideas, they know, like they're not fooled, and you can try to fool them, but like they don't want to be a part of it. Like they just want you to be real. They want you to be honest. So I think if you want to engage them, the best thing to do is be honest about where you are. And like me and you have both seen, that's what they want. That's what engages them. And honestly, in the long run, that's what's best. Like we need to know how to wrestle with our questions, not just because if you just hand people, this is the right answer, and then all of a sudden they find out that you were wrong and that it wasn't the right answer or there's a better answer. Well, now they're going to question everything you said because they're like, well, you were so,
and they should,
yeah.
But the problem is they won't know how to handle that. Exactly. And it might cause them to throw themselves into yet another manipulative or toxic ideology because this one wasn't right. So then whatever is diametrically opposed to it must be right.
Yeah.
Or because any number of things could come.
Yeah, there's a certain amount of safety you feel whenever you hold black and white answers. Like you don't have to think for yourself anymore. Oh man, and that I feel like that's a huge part of it is you're not allowed to think for yourself. Other people have to think for you and make the decision of what's right for you. And that's, I think, a part of why churches are afraid to allow people to ask questions and be uncertain, because now you're thinking for yourself and they can't control that. They can control it if you're just handing out black and white answers and dogmas, but they can't control your honest search of truth because they can't control it.
Well, maybe we should bring things back around. That was a really valuable conversation for sure. And maybe we can, I don't know, we just touched a lot on it. So I don't know if there's enough to talk about still for it to be another episode.
Oh
But
yeah.
kind of branched into talking about working within the church, especially from this place of more, I guess, honesty about where we are. So that's really cool. But to bring things back to the topic of heaven.
Well, hold on.
Okay. Yeah.
But before we do, I do want to kind of wrap up especially the topic of worship. And I think, I wanted to throw out kind of like my credibility. Like I was a worship leader for how many years is that? 6 years. And 7 if you count me when I was a junior in high school. But like I was like a worship leader at a church, like the worship leader for 6 years. Obviously in like different churches, but it's because I was in college in and out and like going to some different places. So like I know the worship world. That's actually what I got my degree in. I spent 3 years in college studying worship. So like I know a bit about it. That was my passion. That was everything to me. Now music is kind of everything to me, not really worship. But what I will say about like, because I do believe this, and I think it's important to throw in, it's important to call out the toxicity, the toxic things in worship culture, but also acknowledge that worship can be, and like really just spiritual music can be used in such a beautiful way. I think if music is used in a way to empower you to self-reflect, to contemplate, to have a spiritual experience and is empowering you, that is going to be probably the healthiest way that you can use music. And that is great. And I think that is how it should be used. The problem that I see is that churches often use it to empower themselves. They use it so that they can capitalize on your vulnerability, so that they can push their ideology, so that they can maintain control over you rather than giving the power back to you. Okay, you had this experience. That is your own. That is amazing. Like, what does that say about what your heart is telling you? Like, what is your body telling you right now? Or even like your spirit or God telling you? And instead of the church is hoarding the power for themselves and using it to empower themselves, they need to use it to empower people, the individuals.
Yeah.
I think.
Would you say that it's kind of the difference between worship music being something which helps you to be more vulnerable and honest with yourself so that you can learn and grow from there, versus worship music that tells you what to think and how to feel?
Yep. Yeah, I think so. And then even like where you go from there, like after worship, like what are they doing? What are they telling you have to do? Are they using that so they can get more money out of you? Which a lot of churches do.
Or get free labor.
Free labor. Yep. Yeah, all of those things. Like it should be something that is empowering you, not empowering the church. And it's great that we can do that as a community too. Like we can have this common experience that we can relate to. But yeah, it's tough. I'm still working through some things because like, I spent a long time doing it. And so I'm having to grapple with things that I said and did on stage and how I used some of the tactics that I now hate, Yeah.
Yeah. And that I think is going to make you a stronger person and a force for good going forward. And I think that especially the insights that you shared in this conversation alone are going to be very helpful to people. And I know that they actually help me when I reflect upon worship and my partaking in it. And when I help my wife with figuring out, worship sets and just any kind of involvement, I find what you have shared to be very valuable. And I hope others will too.
Yeah, I hope so too.
Where we were kind of starting to dip our toes before we dove into the really enriching conversation about involvement with worship and teaching within a church, we were starting to talk about heaven in terms of being a place that is sort of the embodiment of what this life was supposed to be. And I want to share a little bit about like the concept of heaven that I grew attached to.
Yeah.
But then the questions that rose up for me. So the way I eventually came to understand heaven was that it would be eventually after this world passed away and all of the consequences of human decisions had reached their conclusion in the death of this world and humanity. After the conclusion is reached, everything would go back to the way it was in the beginning. And heaven and earth would be this overlapping place. And the earth would turn into a place where humanity co-ruled over creation with God. And biblically, the way I would think about that would be to look to Jesus and his example of servant leadership. And so humanity's purpose would be to serve creation and bring out its potential in a way that doesn't bring harm to it and to others and to other life forms, so that scientific research and finding and discovery of this incredible world and universe that God's created can go without without being hindered by like corporate greed and just the evil ways that we study science in order to find out how to control and kill each other.
Yeah.
So it would be free of all that. And humanity would be able to go on and explore the stars and the wonders of the universe for eternity and all the infinite things there are to learn. So that was how I liked to think about heaven for a while.
Yeah.
But one question I feel like that brings up, and many other concepts of heaven as well, is the question of what is the point of this life then?
Yeah. That is the big question, is what is the point of this life? Because whenever you have something of that magnitude that you're working towards, why does it matter what I do here? My life is a blip in the span of eternity. So like what is the point of this life? And that's where it can easily just turn into, it's the point of this life is to get to the afterlife. But then that makes this life kind of pointless. Like, why did
why didn't we just start in the afterlife?
Yeah.
One person I talked to made the argument that, well, we live in this life experiencing these things because we need to go through all the sufferings of this life so we can learn what is good and what is bad. And my immediate thought in response to that is, well, if knowledge gained is just patterns on our brains, why wouldn't God just make us with that information preloaded?
Yeah. And that also is somewhat diminishing of people suffering here, is like, oh, you need to go through that so you know how good heaven is. But then if you're not a Christian, then you're just going to continue to suffer. It just turns like it doesn't work. And
then what of all the people who die while still in the womb, but do so painlessly? Like, was their existence meaningless? Like, are they just going to be this emotionless, don't know good, don't know bad blob of a human being in heaven?
Right.
Like, there's so many concepts or so many facets to the concept of heaven, which really don't make sense with a lot of the experiences that we have. There's just so much variety of experiences of humans on Earth.
Yeah. Or even people who are born with like very severe, like mental disabilities, who can't really understand anything. Like, do they need to can you say that they have gained enough knowledge about good and evil that like, oh, okay, well now it's good that they existed so that now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying anything about like they should not exist, but like I'm just saying whenever you put this weird condition of like having to have a knowledge of good and evil, like it once again turns into this like you have to have this special knowledge, which that in itself is like a Gnostic idea. Like the idea of like
it becomes extremely ableist.
It does. Yeah. It's dumb. It's ableist and many other things, but it diminishes our existence here.
Yeah. I will say, like, especially reflecting upon it now, I could see how it could all make sense if everybody is one singular collective consciousness that's all going to come back together again someday, referring back to the egg video. And so, I mean, I could see how that would make sense, and that every experience is contributing towards the maturity of a singular entity. But without that in place, it really, like this, the point of this existence, especially just from the raw Christian take on what heaven is, it really, heaven and this afterlife just really makes this life seem so pointless. Like, I just cannot conceive of a universally true reason for existing prior to being in heaven.
Now, this is a possibility that this was my favorite possibility that I guess I haven't mentioned yet. Whenever I was still a Christian, that I think would not diminish this life, but also still include heaven, I guess. This comes from my favorite podcast, it was my favorite podcast, the Bema podcast. That's BEMA podcast by Marty Solomon. Whenever he gets in session 3, which if you're going to listen to it, start at the beginning, don't just start random places. Like, it won't make sense. He's building a whole theology here. But he talks about, whenever Jesus talks about heaven coming to earth, like, whenever he prays, like, your kingdom come now on earth as it is in heaven, like the theology that he has there, at least the one that, because everybody has different interpretations of things, but he thinks that what Jesus means is this, he calls it 3-part eschatology. So right now, like, we've got, like, in the beginning, there was heaven and earth united, and then there was a split, right? Whenever the fall happened. And now we are working towards reuniting heaven and earth. And it's not this moment, like, that's a 2-part eschatology would say there's going to be a moment or a rapture or a whatever event that then boom, now heaven and earth are united. The way that Jesus seems to talk about it, like whenever he talks about like leaven in bread growing, or like the mustard seed starting small and then growing unstoppably, it's this constant growth of the kingdom until there is no evil anymore. And so I don't really know. So there's not like an event that starts this, but it will eventually just grow and grow. And so that makes our life purposeful, because our goal is then to bring that kingdom here, is to bring what we expect and hope for in the future here now. I really think it would make our life a lot more purposeful if the goal was not to like wait for some event to happen, but for us to actually bring that event. Like in Peter says, like he says, I pray that we hasten the day, and like almost like gives this weird, like something we don't talk about, like, wait, we have some control about the day that's coming that you're talking about. And so like that's partly where he gets some of that theology. But I thought it was really interesting. And that was my favorite view of heaven, because it did give more purpose to this life than just like waiting for some day to come. Like, no, I'm bringing the day. Like I am bringing heaven to earth. And obviously your view of heaven changes what you think that means. But
I think that Tim Mackey speaks to that same theology. So anybody who might be confused by the concept, there is a Bible Project video that is called Heaven and Earth, or it's on Heaven and Earth. You should be able to find it pretty easily if you look Bible Project Heaven and Earth. But it speaks to this idea of like how Jesus was the temple that is heaven on earth, and then Christians thereafter are to be that temple and to spread it so that heaven can be on earth, this earth, the one that is now and not going to be dead. But I think that speaks to that same theology. So if you're confused by this whole thing, that might be helpful, but I totally see what you mean there. Although one thing that I've always wondered in the context of that theology is, what then is the afterlife? Like, are we, once heaven and earth are fully overlapping again, is everybody who has passed away going to be resurrected? Is there a cycle of reincarnation that's happening that's going to make it so that anybody who's alive has been alive by the time heaven and earth overlap? Have you heard anything like, what is your understanding of the afterlife in the context of heaven coming to this earth?
That's a great question. Speaking from that point of view, at least in the podcast, like they hold enough uncertainty that they're like not making claims about what that's going to be, because we could speculate all day about how that would happen, but how in the world would we know? How in the world would we know? We can't. And so it's almost not even worth like we could throw out a million different ideas. Like, and you know, there's the idea that there's going to be a new heaven, new earth. So like maybe God just makes like a giant earth that's going to be able to hold all the like billions of people who have died in the past who are going to be resurrected, or there's going to be some interesting reincarnation things going on. Like, who knows? It could be a number of things, but it's something that we just can't know.
I think that's a good place to be. I mean, neither of us are completely certain. We don't have any golden knowledge that we can bless the world with. We're in this place of uncertainty together.
Yeah.
A question that I don't think we've explored just yet, but how might the concept of heaven be harmful?
Multiple ways. One way that I've seen it is people who have this view of heaven that sounds very capitalistic. Like, I am going to have a mansion. I'm going to have all the riches in the world. And it's weirdly centered around materials and having like gold and a mansion and being separated from society. Like, this kind of sounds like what you want now.
Individualistic, even. Yeah.
Like, and so like, if that is your view of heaven and the ideal, like if that, like, that's what it's supposed to be, right? The ideal, like what you were made for, if that's your ideal, that's going to influence how you live now. And so like, you probably are going to chase those things now. You're going to at least wish for those things now. And people might kind of shame you out of that or tell you that you deserve that if you're a mega church pastor. And so like, if that's heaven, then man, you can like pursue that all you want on earth, because like, that's the ideal you're going to have in heaven anyway. So like, what's wrong with having it on earth? And then that taking the community aspect out of it makes you care less about people. It's kind of a very individualistic thing. Like, I'm going to get a mansion for me.
Becomes very selfish.
Yeah. And that too, it just becomes selfish, just like how hell is like the negative, selfish way out where you're like trying to save yourself from something. Heaven is the selfish thing you're working for. like it's not a selfless thing. Like, whenever you're working towards a reward for yourself, like, that is once again kind of selfish. Like, at least like it's only benefiting you. And so then on earth, you know, you might make yourself feel better by trying to get other people to heaven, but still your ideal heaven is about you.
I think that one way that I've seen it, which I feel like builds upon what you just explored, one way I've seen it be very harmful is, especially in those theologies that make heaven a very distinct and separate place from the world we're living in right now, that breeds this general apathy towards caring for the environment and caring for the health of not only yourself and but also other people.
Yeah.
Like, when we're viewing everything in this reality that isn't of spiritual nature as being temporary, then we also tend to view it as being disposable.
Yeah.
And that is incredibly toxic. Mm-hmm. And I feel like we see that in people who litter without any regard for the environment and how that might hurt other people indirectly down the road. We see that through people not caring about their own health it's hard to bring up the issue of health, because there is definitely a distinction between people who have the facilities to maintain and upkeep their health, but there's an extent of privilege that comes with health as well.
Oh, for sure.
And having that ability. So I don't mean to shame anybody who finds themselves in an unhealthy situation that's out of their control. But
Yeah.
I do think it's important that if it is within a place within your control, that you should pursue that, not only as a way to help yourself, but also as a way to enable yourself to love others better.
Yeah. And also, like, part of the idea of heaven that is really toxic is like you are just a disembodied soul up there. And so this body, you always talk about, like, you know, the flesh is bad, that your body is evil and sinful. It's just like, I want to get out of this body. So yeah, if you hate your body, you're not going to take care of it. You're if anything, I see people who are just like quite literally, it's amazing how many people I ran into in the small town that I lived in, like even just out when I was like, because I worked part-time at the church and was part-time doing like furniture and appliance deliveries. People were just ready to die. Like that's all they wanted. And I'm like, if this is your one life, what a sad thing to think that you have this hope in the afterlife that makes you completely disregard your life now, that you're just ready to die. Like you're ready to just throw away the rest of your life.
It's like people go out of their way to accelerate their demise because they have this concept of a better life thereafter. And that is very sad. That is very unfortunate and a very negative consequence of the concept of heaven as being something which is totally separate from what we have right now.
Oh yeah.
But there are definitely benefits to this concept of heaven being totally separate from what we have right now, in that there can be hope for, and this is an interesting theology / concept that I've wrestled with mentally. And it's this idea that, like, if it is completely separate, then bad things might happen to you, but at least it's not going to carry over into the next life. Even though, like, there's some people that will use the temporary nature of this life as a way to abuse it. There's other people who hold on to that as a hope of like, oh, maybe I'll be able to walk again someday. But then there's also this whole idea of like, maybe that's ableist of us, and there's a certain amount of identity that can be found in disabilities that makes it not necessarily a bad thing thereafter. And that's something I've heard people talk about that I don't even know how well I'm receptive to it even now.
Yeah.
But it's a point of wrestling for me, in that like, why would the physical ailments from this life carry on, especially like if you get nuked and you're eviscerated into oblivion? Like, obviously there's going to be something that you're given afterwards, right? I mean,
yeah,
I don't know. It's this interesting theology which surrounds disabilities.
Actually,
and I don't know how to feel about that.
Yeah, that is a whole topic in itself, because you're right. Like that can bleed over into so many ableist beliefs about people, because then once you start talking about like, well, in heaven, like you're healed of everything, you are brought to like your whole self, then you start deciding what that means, like what it means to be fully human, to be truly human, to be a good human, healed, or a healed human. And so some people might look at people who are autistic and say, oh yeah, like you won't be autistic in heaven. Like, what? Like, is it wrong to be autistic? Is there something wrong with that? Like, I don't know. I don't think so. I think that like people who are autistic are beautiful and like are amazing. So like, are they going to be healed of that? Because if you think that's going to be, or healed, that's, that's what people would say. I don't think they need to be healed of anything. But like, if that's your belief, yeah, that's toxic. Like that will bleed into how you treat people now.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that even that overlaps quite a bit with the way that people see and treat members of the LGBTQ plus community.
Yeah.
In that there's this, even in some circles where people don't condemn homosexuality and that whole group, there's still this tendency to look at them as lesser than, or, oh, someday in heaven, you will be cured of this thing, which is bad.
Yeah.
And who are we to even say what is truly human? And you get into this toxic concept of what is the ideal, and then that automatically makes the flip side of what is not the ideal. And then
Mm-hmm.
it's very easy to go from there to plastering the label of evil and
Yep.
bad, and then have that affect the way we affect or the way we treat other people. And that's just really something that bothers me.
Bothers me too. Yeah. There's going into this conversation, there's a lot more toxic things than I thought of originally. But that is true. Like whatever you think heaven is what you think the ideal is, what you think truly good is, like what truly human is. And that can be extremely degrading to other people. And that just affects how you view and treat other people. So it's interesting that like, and I think that is part of like my heart and a lot of things that I talk about is that our beliefs are not just beliefs. They're not just things in our head. They're not just ideas. They take form in who we are and they affect how we treat other people. Even things that like we wouldn't think of, like our belief in heaven does affect how we view and treat other people right now, like today. And so, yeah, it's something we need to think about.
Yes. So one question that I think was our goal to focus on, especially throughout the past like 3 episodes and this one including, but I don't think we really touched on it very directly or very frequently, just because it seems like a really odd question to ask. And I feel like, I don't know about you, but I feel like I've been conditioned not to ask it. So I feel like there's a lot of points when we maybe should have asked it up to this point, but didn't. But that's this whole idea of, okay, well, what do these things say about the nature of God? So we talk a lot about what they say about the nature of us because that's comfortable to talk about. But it's a little more uncomfortable to talk about like what it says about God. And that's always uncomfortable because like we get into this place of, well, who are we to say anything about the character of God and whether or not he's just or what attributes apply to him. We are so lowly and small beings. So I think that it's maybe the better way of phrasing it so that it's more approachable is, what does this say about our understanding of God and the human concept of who God is?
Yeah. And I think we definitely somewhat touched on that last episode. Like, is God like vengeful and vindictive, or is he all forgiving, or, like, is he a monster? Like we like somewhat touched on it. I think there's like a few different ways. Like if you believe that we're just going to be like singing worship songs and that's our ultimate purpose, then our understanding of God, that he could be somewhat egotistical. Like he's just concerned about his own, like he just wants to be worshiped, doesn't care really much about you. Just wants you to always be bowing and worshiping to him.
And a lot of people would say rightfully so, because they'd say, well, he's definitely he's worthy of worship and all these things, which other people would look at, would side-eye you and be like, is he though?
Is he? He? Because
especially if all he wants is to be worshipped and that's it, then why are we, like, it really brings up the question again, why are we here? Why are we doing these things exactly?
Why should we love anyone except that, oh, well, God told us to, so I guess I have to, why? Why would he tell us to?
Why not just make us worshiping from the start and just have us go on doing that forever?
Yeah. Like, anyway. And that's usually coming out of somewhat of a reformed theology of like God's main purpose is his own glory. And so like we are nothing, we are evil, and so we deserve hell. And like I don't know, all those things kind of weave together.
So what does should this whole world and everything in it, and our bodies and our relationships, should everything in this world be disposable? And God's intention is for all to be made new. What does that say about God?
I think it could say some things like, well, maybe this life was a mistake. If it's all
maybe
just,
God made a mistake.
if it's all just going to be thrown away, like, I don't know, that doesn't seem like a very great plan. They're like, oh, I'm going to make something. And then like halfway through history, or maybe not even, like maybe way later, however long this earth has been around, way later in history, I'm going to send the solution that you better know this solution. And then after that, like, I mean, that's the solution, but also I'm just going to like throw everything away anyway. So kind of just doesn't seem like the best game plan.
Yeah, it definitely tarnishes the concept of God having omni attributes, in that it makes it really seem like he didn't have good foresight and good planning. But that's also coming from our very limited scope and viewpoint. So maybe there's more to that theology that we are not giving it credit for. So if somebody out there is grinding their teeth because that's the case, then I'd encourage you to find the YouTube video version of this. I think this is going to be episode 6, and leave a comment clarifying things and make sure that your comment is open to discussion. This whole podcast and community is about exploring possibilities and not being arrogant and stating things that we don't really know as though we do. But I understand if you might think that you totally do know, and I hope that you would provide good reason for your certainty in that regard.
Yeah, definitely.
But yeah, it definitely feels like God in that context doesn't have a complete control of what's going on.
Yeah,
what's going to happen.
And if he does, then it just doesn't seem super concerned about us, like we are not super high on his priority list, which maybe it is, maybe we're not. And maybe that's fine. I just think, I don't know. That's not a very helpful. I feel like that's just not a very like helpful view to how we should live now, because then we can just think, well, I guess like God just doesn't care much about us. So, and he's going to do whatever he wants with us once we die. So I'll do the best I can. But
I feel like another concept that falls into that category of like, how powerful is God really, is the idea of like the purpose of this existence being to learn things. And that it really brings into the question, like, okay, can God not preload that information onto our brains? If the purpose of us is to learn things, like, why can't the things that we have to learn be instinctual? Like, why can't we just grow and develop into a place of having empathy and understanding? Why do we have to experience suffering in order to understand it? Why can't that just be an instinct? And if that's the case, like I was talking with one guy about it, and he was talking about how, well, God can't just make it so we learn everything right off the bat, because that would defeat the purpose of being a human being. That'd defeat the purpose of existing. But the thing is, if knowledge and the knowledge that we have to gain is finite, and we are eternal beings, then eventually, if that's what it means to be human, is learning, then eventually we're just going to cease to be human, because there will be nothing more to learn in an eternity of exploring a finite thing. And so,
interesting.
Then the question that becomes not an issue, because why does it matter that we instinctually learn this thing if there's an infinite amount of knowledge to be gained beyond it? Like, it seems like it seems this existence and all of its sufferings seem pointless.
Sure. Yeah, I can see that. Though I think
if that's the only purpose of it.
Yeah. But I think there is something beautiful to discovery, though. Like, as you learn and like discover that maybe that is a part of being human, is like our desire and love for discovery. But
I guess what I was getting at is the idea of like, if our purpose is to discover, that makes sense. But if our purpose is to discover, then there has to be an infinite amount of things to discover if we are immortal. And if there's an infinite amount of things to discover, then what does it matter that we come preloaded with some of that information?
Yeah.
Like, we don't have to have all of it right off the bat, just some of it, so we don't have to go through all the suffering of this life.
Yeah. That is an interesting thought. Yeah, it makes me think of, have you seen The Good Place? that TV show?
I have actually. Yeah, it's a
Have
good
you
show.
seen
I'd
all of
recommend
it?
it to anybody.
So
Yes.
good. Talking about the afterlife. That's a great show.
Mhm.
Incredibly funny. But I love like when they've, okay. If you haven't watched it, spoiler alert, please skip like a few minutes ahead because I'm going to spoil like the ending a little bit. So that was your warning. So if you've gotten this far, like stop. Okay. So in the end, whenever they finally get to the good place and they're all like just bored out of their minds because like they've done everything. They've done literally everything. Right. And so anyway, that just made me think of like what you said, like you just get bored and mind numb because like you will have discovered everything. And like they did in the end of the show, like they lost themselves. Like they were actually miserable in the good place until they had a way or like basically a time limit on it.
Yeah, the question is raised, is it better that we just cease to exist eventually? Because in essence, if everything comes to completion, then we've already ceased to exist because we've done everything. What is existence if there's nothing to do?
Yeah, we'll have to talk about that sometime. I know the Liturgist podcast has a really interesting theory on like, or has a really interesting episode on talking about what it means to even be alive. And I think it's in their episode of resurrection. Like, what does it even mean to die? Is it that your body stops working? Is it that like, or like when people are dying and are on the deathbed and it's like, yeah, like Martha was dying, but like, the last few months, it just wasn't her. Like Martha was gone. What does that mean? What does it mean that Martha was gone? And it's that Martha or whoever, we are not just bodies, like we are a story that's unfolding. And when that story, I guess, like talking about an eternity, if our story no longer is a story anymore, what are we? What do we become? Are we even human anymore? I don't know. Yeah. I doubt it. That's interesting. That's an interesting thought. I never thought of that.
I definitely think that if there is an eternity of things to discover and learn, then that means there's probably going to be an eternity of obstacles to overcome. I don't think heaven will be a place without obstacles because that would just be completely pointless. Maybe. It might just be that I have no concept of what it means to exist in that kind of reality. And maybe there is something to it.
We don't know. Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's interesting how much stock we put in something we don't know very much about or know anything about. Things we think we know maybe some things about, but probably don't because we've never been there. We've never seen it. Never talked to somebody who's been back from it because you don't really come back from it. And I kind of talked about last episode why I don't believe any of those stories of people dying and coming back from heaven. But we put so much stock in that and lose a lot of stock in this life.
Well, I think this is a good place to wrap up. Hey, Micah, where can people find us?
People can find me at Pondering Together on TikTok. You can find Christian at Truth Voyager, and you can find our TikTok page at Morning Ponderings, and our podcast is the Morning Ponderings podcast. So thank you all for joining, and please join in the discussion. And so I think it was a good conversation.
Can you say bye-bye, Levi?
Bye-bye, Levi.
Everybody have a great day.
Indeed. Have a great day. Bye, everyone.
Everybody, welcome our guest to the show. This is my son, Levi.
I want a little choppy.
You want some choppy milk?
Hey, Caleb, I want more choppy milk.
That's not Caleb. His name is Micah. Can you say Micah?
Micah.
You can say, hi, Micah.
Hi,
Yeah.
Micah. I get more choppy milk.
He get more choppy milk.